Well, in this video I'm going to explain how to tell apart M.2 SSDs. So M.2 SSDs usually come in three formats, three different pinouts. So these are on the bottom here. The three types of SSD cards, M.2 SSD cards. Then at the top you hit the two types of sockets on the left. This is an older M.2 SATA socket for SATA SSDs. They were the first generations of M.2 drives. They were SATA, the older, the slower version of storage. Then on the right here you see the more current, the current, this is the more typical socket nowadays in motherboards. This is the only one you are going to find if you on a motherboard if it is relatively new. This is like a universal socket. So these sockets usually will do both NVMe and SATA. This is always going to do NVMe. You may find motherboards that do only NVMe. What is the PCI Express version of the SSD, of the M.2 SSD. But usually these motherboards are also able to do SATA. So this pins, the socket is actually bound to the actual PCI Express bus, and usually it's also bound to the SATA bus. Okay. If it is able to do SATA or not, it's something you will have to make sure by looking at the specs for this motherboard. But this socket will always do NVMe. It may do also SATA. And then these are the three types of SSDs, M.2 SSDs. On the left, this is the older SATA only. SATA SSD. This on the right is an NVMe SSD always. It may be the slower PCI Express 2 lanes version or the faster. Usually this is the case that they use now currently most SSDs and motherboards, but SSDs they usually do the PCI Express 4 lanes PCI Express NVMe version. So this is never going to be a SATA drive. If you see an SSD with this pinout, this is always going to the NVMe or PCI Express, which is basically the same. And then this type of SSD, this pinout, is usually going to be a SATA SSD, but it may be an NVMe PCI Express 2 lanes, the slower one. Okay. So this is always like that. Okay. This on the left is SATA. This is going to be NVMe, and this is either going to be one or the other. If it is NVMe, it is going to be the slower version of 2 lanes, PCI Express lanes. So I wanted to mention also that of course there are other types of M.2 sockets for wireless cards and other devices. Like this at the bottom, these are the other two types of M.2 sockets, KE and KA and KE. But the ones I am discussing here are for storage drives. Okay. So let's see some examples. For example, this one, you can see two drives here. So the two at the top are SATA drives. In order to know that, I had to actually Google the model number, because the drive itself doesn't say anything if it is SATA or NVMe. These two at the bottom, it shows clear here that NVMe, you see in both of them. Well, in this case you don't need to add lettering. If you see this pinout is always going to be NVMe drive. Okay. To know if it is 2 lanes or 4 lanes, you will need to look at maybe the lettering, or maybe you may need to Google the model number. Then also I wanted to also say about the length of the card, and the longer is usually going to be more storage capacity. These are usually long, to 110, 110. This is an unusually long card. Usually you will find them in these T3 lengths. Well, more clearly, this is going to be usually 2242, 2260, and 2280. So the 22 is the width of the card in millimeters, and the 80 or 60 or 42 is the length of the card. So usually the longer the card, the more storage. Not always the case. For example, these two cards are 800 gigabytes and the same capacity. But usually the longer the card, the more capacity. Usually when you see a 2280, it's going to be a 1 terabyte or more, usually, if you buy a relatively new card. I want to also mention about compatibility. So, well, let's show first some examples here. Let me see. Yeah. So this, for example, is this at the top is a SATA drive, at the bottom NVMe. When they have two notches, they are going to be usually SATA, but they may be the slower version, as I said, of NVMe. This is NVMe drive. You cannot tell just by looking at it if it is 2 lanes or 4 lanes of PCI Express, but you know that it's NVMe because it has only these 5 pins here on the right. Yeah, about compatibility, I want to mention that. Well, let me see first. Let me show you first this example. This is an old motherboard. You can see on the left, this is an M.2 socket for a wireless card, and on the right you can see an M.2 socket for a SATA drive. And regarding compatibility, so this is here on the top right is a socket from NVMe. So you can use either any SSD that is NVMe is going to work here. So whether it is 2 lanes or the faster PCI Express 4 lanes NVMe drive is going to work. Of course, it's going to be slower if, this motherboard, if the socket has this, if a motherboard has this socket, this is going, this may do NVMe 2 lanes. Usually it's going to do NVMe 4 lanes, PCI Express 4 lanes, but you may find a cheaper motherboard that, looking at this socket, that it is for, internally is using only 2 PCI Express lanes. And as I said, you have to look up the specifications to learn if this is able to do SATA. Okay. So as I said, you can use any type of NVMe drive. It's always going to work in this kind of socket. Of course, you won't be able to fitting or to slotting an NVMe SSD on this one because this is the notch is going to block you from. It's going to. This is only for SATA. Okay. Okay, so here are some examples. So on the left you see a socket for an old SATA SSD. On the right is a more universal one. This can be, usually it's going to do SATA or NVMe. Usually, if it does SATA or not, you have to usually look at the motherboard specifications. These are the top SATA, bottom NVMe. I think I said that. This is NVMe. This is NVMe. You see, this has 2 notches, so this is usually going to be, this is for a SATA card, but sometimes, like in this case, these are NVMe 2 lanes. This is 2 lanes NVMe. And this is specifications for a motherboard. Usually you will find, like in this case, that the motherboard is able to do both SATA and NVMe. So if you have a cheaper SATA M.2 drive, you will be able to use to fit it in here and use it. And that's all I wanted to say. I think I said everything. Thank you for watching.